Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Nun Dalet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Shiur Dishon in honor of the birthday of her son, Sergeant Eitan Dishon, who fell in the Swords of Iron War. Eitan, who loved Torah and whose light illuminated his face and guided his path, merited me, his mother, to learn Daf Yomi every day with the Hadran group. Thank you for this important and meaningful endeavor. May his memory be blessed. Okay, we're going to get started with the concept of the drusa. If you remember, we've been talking about a drusa, an animal that gets clawed, and there's a concern that there's poison in the body. And then we talked yesterday about a way that you can check. Once you do the shechita, you check. So we have this machloket about a suffix drusa. I'm just reminding you of a few important points that will be relevant. Rav and Shmuel. Rav said a suffix drusa is totally fine if you're not sure if it's clawed or not. According to Shmuel, it's a problem. And then we said, that's when you would go and check. Then we said that there was this machloket between, seems Rashi says, the only time you're checking is really the suffix drusa case, which would basically mean that it's only according to Shmuel and not according to Rav, right? At least that's what it sounds like. And then Tosfot says, based on a sugya we're going to learn today, that he thinks the check that people are doing is, he quotes the Rivam first and Rashi, and that both of them think that it's only a, right, I think this is where he quotes the Rivam, Rav Yitzchak Rabbi Meir, and he says, all of them think that drusa doesn't need bedika. A drusa, if it's definitely clawed, it's immediately a problem. It doesn't help to check. But Tosfot himself thinks, and we're going to see why in today's stuff, that you actually can check if it's an actual drusa. And if it was clawed, and you don't see any signs, which today we're going to learn exactly what you're checking for. We learned you do it opposite the b'nei me'ayim, basically meaning in the torso of the animal. You check for red signs, right? If there's redness there, you can assume there was poison. If it's not, then you can assume not. So again, there's a debate whether this is only in a suffix case or even in a definite case where you know it was clawed. Still, you can check maybe no poison went in, right? Just because it was clawed doesn't necessarily mean that poison went in, or maybe you can't check and you have to just always assume it's a treif. So now that's just a little background, something we're going to see shortly. I'm a Rav Papi. We're going to start from the bottom of Nun Gimel Amud Bet, the last few words. By Rav Bibi bar Abaye. So Rav Bibi bar Abaye asked the following question. Veshet, first, it was a question that first says, he says, okay, this I know. What about this? Veshet mikuvato b'mashu, drusato b'mashu. Okay, if the veshet has a hole of mashu, of any size, then, and therefore, when we were looking for drusa, since a hole of any size is going to make it a treifa, also a drusa any size is going to make it also a problem. Kaneh nikuvato b'kisal, drusato b'kama. But the windpipe, which has a hole of mashu, is not a problem. It has to be a hole the size of an issar, of a coin, right? This bigger coin. How much do you have to find that's red in the kaneh? If you remember, we talked yesterday that it's also checking in the windpipe, and the gullet. So drusato the kaneh and the veshet, both of them, both the simanim, how much is going to be an issue in the windpipe? So drusato b'kama. To which he answers, Batar Abaye hadar pashte. After he asked the question, he actually answers it himself. Echad ze v'echad ze b'mashu. Both of these are b'mashu. In other words, even in the kaneh, even in the windpipe, even though generally a treifa will be if there's a cut or a tear or a hole of a bigger size, still the sign of redness that we're looking for poison is b'mashu, any size. My time. Well, what's the reason? Because zira mikla kale va'azil. The poison basically burns through the body. So if it starts as a little spot, if the animal hadn't been slaughtered, it would have continued and gotten bigger and eventually gotten to the size of an issar. And therefore, both in the kaneh and the veshet, any little size is going to be a problem. Yativ Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta kamei to Rav Nachman. Now we're going to have two parallel stories. The first is Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta sits in front of Rav Nachman, the Yativ b'kamar, and he says the following. Drusasha amru, tzricha b'dika keneged b'nei me'ayim. This is what we saw yesterday. The check you do is opposite the b'nei me'ayim, the innards, which basically means the torso of the body. But it doesn't really include the kaneh and the veshet, the two simanim, because they are more toward the neck, right? They're not really in the torso. Rav Nachman amar, Hey Elohim, I swear in the name of God, more barav mikafa v'ad atma. Rav taught us that you do it from the kafa to the atma. Atma is the arech, is the thigh. Kappa, it sounds like kaf hayad or something. We're going to see what this is. My kappa, ilem a kappa diyad. If you're going to say it's the kaf of the hand, but we don't really mean the hand. What we mean is the shoulder bone, okay, where the arm comes out of. And basically, you're saying check from, right? Imagine the animal standing, right? But basically, the body's like this, and from the shoulder bone to the thigh bone, that's basically the same as saying opposite the b'nei me'ayim, because that's the whole torso. So hainu kineged b'nei me'ayim, it's the same thing. So you can't say that Rav Nachman said, Rav said something different when he said the exact same thing. Ela mikapa de mocha ad itma. What he meant is the kaf of the brain, meaning from the skull all the way down. And that would already include the kanen, the veshet, right? So, okay. So there we have this machloket. Now, here I'm going to tell you where Tosfot comes in and proves his point. He says, if Rav here requires, right, first of all, Rav notices machmir here, right? When it came to Safek Drusa, he was lenient. When it comes to checking, he's more stringent about what, you have to check the whole, right? You have to check almost the whole body, basically, from the head, right, from the skull until the thigh. That's most of the body. It's definitely more inclusive than the other. Now, let's think about it. If Rav requires a bedika, and the bedika is only for a Safek Drusa, but Rav says for Safek Drusa you don't need to check, so then why would Rav require any bedika ever? So basically, Tosfot says that's a big difficulty on Rashi and the Rivam, who think that the bedika is only for Safek Drusa. Then what's Rav talking about a bedika when Rav doesn't even think you need to check? Rav thinks the animal's automatically kosher. So that's Tosfot's big point to say, doesn't make sense, but what Rashi and the Rivam say, it must be that this check can be done even if the animal was definitely clawed. You still check because maybe there was no poison that got into the animal, to the internal organs. So then you check the animal and you see it. If there's no signs, you can actually allow the animal to be kosher. So that's Tosfot's big claim to try to knock out the other two approaches. Okay, now we're going to hear a really interesting story. It's going to be a kind of similar conversation, but then it's going to go off on a tangent. Okay, the same kind of conversation that happened with Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yisrael Bar Marta. We have the exact same thing, but there's something else going on here because we're going to start with a chacham from Babylonia who goes to Eretz Israel, Kislik, when he went up, Rav Chia Bar Yosef. Chia Bar Yosef was a student of Rav, goes to Israel, okay, and what's going to be interesting about the story is you're going to see the tension between the Babylonians and the Israelis, and you have to remember what time period we're talking about here. It's going to be Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, so end of first, beginning of second generation. And if you remember what happens in the first generation, right, in the time of the Tanaim, the centers in Israel, when Rav, one of the first Amoraim, comes to Babylonia, right, he studied with Chia, who was his uncle, and with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Then he comes to Babylonia. He sets up the first big yeshiva in Babylonia, and from there, basically, students start coming there. Students start leaving Israel and going to Rav, not just because it was a big yeshiva there, but also things were getting bad in Israel. People started leaving, and basically, it starts the whole shift of where the center of Judaism is, and that obviously causes tension between the two places. So this is a good story for that. So when Rav Chia Bar Yosef goes to Israel and he hears Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish engaging in a conversation about this topic, they said, you need to check the innards, right, opposite the intestines in the inner part of the torso. Amar Lahu, so same reaction that Rav Nachman had a few generations later, right, a generation or two later. So this Rav Chia Bar Yosef also says, Amar Lahu, Elohim, More Barav Mikafavad Atma. He says, right, I swear in the name of God that Rav taught us from Kafa'ad Atma, which means including more. Amar Lahu Reish Lakish. Now here, instead of in the previous, where that was the end of the story, other than we just had to figure out what was Kafa, but that was the Gemara talking, that wasn't the story anymore. Amar Lahu Reish Lakish. Manu Rav, Manu Rav, Lo Yadan. Who is this Rav? Who is this Rav? And I don't know him. I don't know who you're talking about. Now, either he didn't know Rav, which is hard to imagine, or, Rav is also just saying Rav, like Rav so-and-so, but you skip his name. Maybe he just says, I don't know which Rav, who are you talking about? Okay, it's not clear. By the way, Rav also, if you remember, in Israel, they get smicha, and in Babylonia there was no smicha, so everyone in Babylonia is called Rav. So maybe it was also saying, oh yeah, these disparaging the rabbis there, they don't even have smicha, and who are they to say anything against us? So he starts basically being really disrespectful and saying, who is this rabbi? I don't know him. And interestingly, Rabbi Yochanan comes to support Rav. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'lo nihira leila oto talmid sheshimesh et Rabbi Rabba v'Rabbi Chia. Do you not remember seeing that student that learned with Rebbe, our teacher, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and with Rabbi Chia? But do you not remember him? You don't remember seeing him? Velohim. And I remember, I swear, right? Everyone's into swearing in these stories. Kol otam shanim sheshimesh oto talmid b'yeshiva, all the years that he was there, right? And shimesh oto talmid b'yeshiva, he was sitting there, and I was standing. Okay, I remember all the days. It's like a double meaning in the yeshiva, but he was b'yeshiva. Okay, and the people who stand are always the people who are the less important ones. If you remember, Rabban Gamliel makes Rabbi Yeshua stand up on his feet. Right, he says you have to stand out of disrespect for him. So basically, he was in a better position than me. He was more respected than I was when we were in yeshiva. Okay, now. Uman Gvaru, what's so great about this rabbi? Rav Gval Bekula. He was great in every area. Okay, he excelled in everything. So Rabbi Yochanan says, do you not remember him? And he tries to refresh his memory. Miya patach Reish Lakish v'amar beram zachor to ha'ish l'tov. So Reish Lakish says, you know what? I remember him. And I remember something good about him. Now, you tell me at the end of the story whether this is good or not, okay? But he says, Sha'amru shmoa mipiv. I know they said something in his name. And he quotes a halacha, okay, that he heard in Rav's name, as if that's going to make him remember Rav. Now, in almost every page of Shas that we've learned, we've seen Rav, right? He's in thousands of machlokot, and of all the ones he's quoting, this is a strange one to be quoting. Okay, so let's think if we can come up with some theory out of this. So what does he say? Shmuta v'shchuta kshera. If you find something dislocated after the shchita, but you see that it was slaughtered in the exact right place, meaning, you see the simanim. Okay, Rashi says it's a kaneh, so let's just go with it's the kaneh, it's the windpipe. You have an animal. You slaughter it, you take it out, right? You open it inside and you see that the windpipe is out of its place, it's dislocated, but it is slaughtered in the right place. So the question is, was it dislocated before the shchita, or did it become dislocated after the shchita? If it became dislocated after the shchita, it's not a disqualification. Animal's kosher. So says Reish Lakish, I heard Rav say that if it was taken out of its place and slaughtered, meaning you find it now, both dislocated but slaughtered in the right place, you can assume it's kshera. She'ifshar l'shmuta she'taseh shchuta. Because if it was dislocated before, there's no way it would have become shchuta. Okay, what would have happened if it was dislocated and you slaughter it in the usual spot? You're going to cut it in the wrong place. Remember, we have the whole thing. Which part of the windpipe can be cut, right, and under it, below it, all above it, right? So it would be dislocated. It wouldn't be properly slaughtered. Okay, before we go on and see what Rabbi Yochanan says, you can think about what he's trying to address here. What's shmuta? Dislocated, right? And he's talking about something dislocated from his place. It's never the same, right? You won't be able to do a proper shchita if it was dislocated before. Now, he actually says in this case it's kshera, but he's quoting Rav, making a statement about dislocating, right, which has to do with Rav, who dislocated from Israel to Babylonia. And it could be he's doing a little bit of oh yeah, I remember him, and this is what he said. And maybe it's saying that Rav wasn't consistent with what he said, because he talked about things that are dislocated are not the same as they were before, and Rav dislocated from his place, and perhaps he's trying to say that Rav is no longer the same as he was before. Now, Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, and again, this is going to have two meanings as far as I'm concerned, as far as this theory that I'm saying. Rabbi Yochanan omer yaviv yakif. So Rabbi Yochanan says, remember mikifin, we take another one and we compare it. We do the same thing to it and we compare. So Rabbi Yochanan says, if you want to know if it was shmuta before or shmuta after, okay, you should test it out. So now there's two interpretations among the Rishonim how to test it out. Either cut the kaneh again and see if it looks the same, the cut that you did, then it must have been dislocated before, because the cut of a dislocated windpipe is going to look different than when it's connected. So we want to know, did you first cut it when it was connected or not? So cut another slice, or take another animal and do the same and see what it looks like, right? Cut it normally and compare the cuts, and then see this one wasn't dislocated, so this one, and does it look the same as that one? So either compare it to itself or compare it to another one. So now you can take this to the same place. Rabbi Yochanan retorts back to Reish Lakish, right? Compare Rav either to himself before he left Babylonia, before he left Israel, and after, or compare him, put him up against any rabbi here. There's no way that any of those rabbis are going to hold their own to Rav, right? Rav is clearly greater, even though he moved to Babylonia. That didn't affect him. So you have this interesting machlokes between two rabbis, specifically in Israel, right? How to look at this move of Rav, and was it a bad thing or a good thing? Did it, and sort of you see the tension. I don't think they're really arguing about reality. Was Rav a great rabbi or not? But Reish Lakish just was trying to say, don't give him too much credit because he left Israel and, trying to keep his stronghold in Israel. Amar Rav Nachman. Now comes Rav Nachman in comments. Some people think he's commenting on what Rav said, the shmuta and shchuta. Some people think he's commenting even according to Rabbi Yochanan, okay, and he's limiting. He's going to say, Lo shanu ela shelo tafas b'simanim. It's only if they weren't holding the simanim when they shechted. Aval tafas b'simanim v'shachat efshar l'shmuta shetaseh shchuta. If the shochet was holding the simanim in place at the time, then, now it could be they were in place to begin with, but if he was holding onto the neck and kind of holding them in place, then theoretically, even if it was dislocated, it would actually be in the right position. And then you won't be able to tell if it was slaughtered properly or not, because it could be it was dislocated, it could be it wasn't. You won't ever have a way to tell. So if the shochet was holding the simanim, it won't really help. Okay, some people say that's just according to Rav, because Rav said, Yefshar l'shmuta shetaseh shchuta. Some people think, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, compare. There are two ways to understand it. Maybe you still could do the comparison and that would help you, or maybe the comparison won't even work in that case, because we can be sure that it was in its place. Okay, so that's the end of that section. Now we're going to finish up finally. Okay, we started on Mem Bet. We're now on Nun Daled. We started the chapter on Mem Bet. We still have a long chapter left to go. We're not close to finishing Elu Treifot, but we are going to finish the first Mishnah. So if you remember, okay, it's a very exciting milestone. So the end of the Mishnah was, after listing the 18 treifot, Zeh HaKlal, this is the rule, Kol she'ein kamo achaya treifa. If an animal can't survive, which we then said 12 months, it's a treifa. So now the Gemara says, okay, whenever it says Zeh HaKlal, the Gemara likes to say, La tuye mai, what's this coming to include? It must be coming to include something. La tuye shev shmatata. Remember what we started, right? It's to include the list of 7 extra treifot the Amoraim added on. Those are all included in the words of the Mishnah. Obviously, the Amoraim said them, right? But they're saying you can derive that from the Mishnah. Anything else that's similar, and those 7 are similar. Debei Yosef Rishba. Okay, Rishba is a hunter. So now we're going to talk about 2 stories of hunters, because the hunters, when they're hunting, you can learn all sorts of things about animals and what's going to cause the death of an animal. Machu, so there's Bei Yosef Rishba from the house of Yosef the hunter. Machu begida nashya bekatle. They shot an animal, let's say shot an arrow in an animal, right at the gida nasheh, okay, the sciatic nerve, and killed the animal. In other words, the animal died just from a wound in the sciatic nerve. Atu the kamed Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, and they said, okay, well, this wasn't listed as a treifa, but look, you see, it caused the death of the animal. Shouldn't it be a treifa? Amar lahu. What, you want to add to this list of treifot? It's a closed list. Treifot are only what the rabbi said are treifot. You can't add anything to the list, even though it caused the death of the animal. So we're going to have to get back to that, because it seems to go against the principle at the end of the Mishnah. If the animal's not going to live 12 months, then it's a treifa. So we'll get back there in a minute. They're going to bring another story. Debei Papa Bar Abba Rishba. Okay, another story that happened in the house of one of these hunters. Machu bekulya v'kale. They shot at a kidney and killed the animal. Kidneys are not problems. There was in one of the lists if the kidney is sick, diseased. Okay, but just removing the kidney even is not a problem. We're going to see that in the next Mishnah. And yet they shot at the kidney and the animal died. Atu l'kamed Rabbi Abba, same thing. They come before Rabbi Abba and said, maybe this should be in the list of treifot. Amar lehu v'chilo sifala treifot yesh. What can we add to the list of treifot? Same exact reaction. And l'chala masha manu chachamim. We only have the list the rabbi said, and that's it. So now the Gemara asks about both these questions. But we saw that the animal died. So how can you not put it on the list? Gemire, we have a tradition. These are both cases that if they had put some medicine on it, it would have saved the animal. So the animal did die, but it doesn't mean the animal had to die. There was a way to prevent it, and that's why these aren't treifot. And the assumption is that anything not listed here is in that category, or at least it seems that way. Okay. New Mishnah. Now we're going to have the parallel Mishnah to our Mishnah. It's going to be all the same things, but right, it's going to be in the case of the alternatives when they're not treifot. Ve'elu ksherot bebehema. Okay, these are the ones that are ksherot. You have this problem in an animal, it's totally fine. Nikva gargeret. Okay, you end up with a hole in the windpipe. Because remember, the windpipe has to be cut, the majority of it, or there's a big hole in it, but not a teeny hole. Ocean istika, or it's cracked. If you remember, we learned that the windpipe, if it's cracked all the way across, but you have a little bit still on either end, because remember, it's this long cylinder with rings. As long as you have a little bit at either end, it's fine. Ad kama techsar, what if you have a hole in it? How much is going to be a problem? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel omer, ad ki issar ha'italki. Okay, until the size, a hole the size of a coin of an issar ha'italki, this Italian coin, which we're going to talk about soon. You know, what was it in the Babylonian coin? Because the Babylonians didn't use the issar ha'italki. Niftecha gulgolet, if the skull cracks open, veloni kev krum shamoach, but the brain membrane is not torn. Remember, we said hole of any perforation of anything in the brain membrane is a problem. In this case, it was completely whole. So that's not a problem. Nikev halev velo lebeit chalelo. There it was, if you had a hole in the heart and it went, a perforation that went all the way down to the ventricles. Now we're going to say it didn't go down to the ventricles. Okay, it was a smaller hole or perforation. Nishbira shidra velo nifsak hachut shela. You have a broken vertebrae, but the spinal cord is not torn. Nitla kavev v'nishyer menu kizayit. This is the one that was a problem that we had to say this actually doesn't go with the previous Mishnah, and we had to say each one is a different opinion. But if the liver is taken out and you only have, right, as long as you have a kizayit of it left. If you remember from the first Mishnah, it sounded like even if you have any bit of it left, it's fine. But this says you have to have a kizayit left. Those are two of the inner stomachs. Now, these are two stomachs that have an opening from one to the other, and the food passes through from one to the other. Since there's already an open path between the two, if you open another path by basically having a hole in one right opposite a hole in the other, that's not a problem, because anyway, there's an opening between the two. So having two openings doesn't make it a treifa. Nitalat chol, if the spleen is taken out, or nitluat klayot, or the kidneys are taken out. This is interesting. So you would think the animals need their kidneys to survive. The rabbis claim that certain animals don't need their kidneys to survive. Okay, they have other ways of doing it. I don't know the reality of that. If anybody wants to check, feel free. But it seems that this would not cause the animal to die not having its kidneys. Nital lechi atachton, if you take out the lower jaw. Nitla ha'em shala, you take out the womb of a female animal. The charuta bidei shamayim. Okay, what is charuta bidei shamayim? If charuta means if the lungs shrivel, like kind of got a little bit shriveled up, what does it mean bidei shamayim? Like thunder or something caused the animal to go into a bit of a panic and it caused the lungs to shrivel. Hagluda. Okay, this was one of the Bazgar, if you remember. There were Shev Shmatata, and then there were the Bazgar, the other four. The Gimel of Bazgar was Gluda, and then we said, if you remember, there's a machloket about this. We quoted this machloket. Rabbi Meir, Machshir Chachamim Poslim. Rabbi Meir thinks if all the hide is off of the animal, there's no more skin on the animal, that's not a treifa, but the Chachamim say it is a treifa. Okay, so this one's a machloket. Starting now with the Gemara. Itmar. It was said. So that's an introduction to a machloket amoraim. Rabbi Yochanan amar elu treifot dafka. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar elu ksherot dafka. Now we have this problem because we have a list. This is these are the treifot and these are the kosher ones. What about things that are in between? Okay. In other words, if you say these are the only treifot and you say these are the only kosher ones, but this doesn't cover everything. So what about some of the areas in between? And we're going to see there's enough kamina of one of them. Okay. So the Rabbi Yochanan says, if we have to learn from one of them, it's that these are the treifot. And according to Reish Lakish, it's these are the ksherot. Now, what's the meaning of this and how's this going to play itself out? We're going to see right now in a bit of a convoluted argument here. What's the machloket? Bid Rav Matna. Their whole machloket is about one of the shev shmatata, okay, of the 7 extra ones. To Amar Rav Matna, hai buka da'atma. This is the head of the femur bone, on top of the thigh. If it was deshaf miduchte, if it was dislocated from its place. So it's still there, but it's dislocated. Comes Rabbanit and says, if that bone, the top of the femur, which is near the pelvis there, is taken out of its place, dislocated, it's a treifa. Okay, so now we're going to see who says what. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, elu treifot dafka. Okay, he says, elu treifot, that means only these. Tana treifot, v'tana ze'aklal. But after listing elu treifot, it did also say, as we ended the previous section, right? But there are ze'aklal. This comes to include more things, turning now to Abaye. So what would you assume? So then you would think that Rav Nachman was included in the zaklal, my time. Why would you think that? Because it's like something that's removed completely. Okay, detached is similar to removed completely. So you would have thought to include it in zaklal. But if we're going to go with Rabbi Yochanan, what does he say? Elu treifot, anything in the middle is not going to be included. So it's like a back and forth. Elu treifot said only these. Zaklal included more. You'd think it would include Rav Matna because it's like natul. Comes the word elu treifot back to the beginning to say, no, only these are treifot, and we're going to exclude hani hu de treifa had Rav Matna kshera. And we're going to actually say that Rav Matna is kosher. Okay? Because again, if he focuses on the elu treifot, that's limiting. So what's confusing about this is first it's limiting, then it's inclusive, but in the end, it's elu treifot dafka, according to Rabbi Yochanan. And then the elu treifot is going to be limiting even within that expansion. And specifically, the one they think to limit is Rav Matna's. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, you'll see why Rav Matna's is the one, because on the one hand, it's dislocated, so it's kind of like something that's removed. But in this version, we're going to see, but it's not really removed, so it's not really like being removed, because it actually is still there. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar elu ksherot dafka. And now here we're going to see the machloket, what he disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. It's obviously going to be about Rav Matna. Tana treifot v'tana ze'aklal. So again, starting with the first Mishnah, we have the treifot, only these, but then we get to the general rule. The general rule is we're going to include more. How many more? Well, he actually doesn't think you would have included Rav Matna in the list. Reish Lakish says, I would have thought it wasn't included in the general, the more general addition here. My time, Lav l'nikuv yadama. It's not like having a hole, having something dislocated. Lo l'psuka damya. It's not like being severed, like cut. I should mean not severed, really cut. Ulinitulinami lo damya. And it's not even close to something removed because it's not removed. It's just dislocated from its place, but it's still there. And therefore, I would have thought that's not on the list from Zaklal. Tana elu kshero, then the next Mishnah comes to say, oh, but these are the ones that are kosher. Hani hu dekshero had Rav Matna treifa. Then we're going to say, but if you didn't have this list, then you would have assumed Rav Matna is fine because it's not part of the treifas and it's not part of the zaklal. However, once you say these are the ones that are kosher, and notice Rav Matna's one is not on the list, anything dislocated is not here. So therefore, we're going to say only these are kosher, and Rav Matna actually turns into a treifa. Okay, so we end up coming to the opposite conclusion about Rav Matna. Is it kosher according to Rabbi Yochanan? Is it, right, according to Reish Lakish, it's going to be a treif. Okay, gufa. Now that we got to Rav Matna, we're now going to go in depth a little bit into Rav Matna. I'm Rav Matna. Hi, bukud eitman deshaf miduchte treifa. Okay, so that's just what Rav Matna says. It's a treifa. Rava amar kshera. Rava actually says it's kosher. The ifsak nive treifa. However, he agrees that if the sinews, that there's sinews that go around the, right, gidim that go around the bone and kind of attach it to its place, if they're cut, then it actually becomes a treifa. And it can be dislocated, but still have these sinews wrapped around. That case, Rava thinks is kshera. But once the sinews tear off, then he agrees it's a treifa. But hilchata, the halacha is, if signami kshera, Until it starts rotting away, it's not a problem, right? Things generally, when they're detached, they eventually start rotting because when they're attached, they have life flowing through them, blood and all that. Once they're detached, they start to decompose. So when it's detached, even without the sinews, we actually paskin that it's not a treifa. Only once it starts to disintegrate, then it becomes a treifa or rot. Okay, now we're moving on to the part about the issar ha'italki. Ad kama techsar, and then what do we say? A hole in the, right? So just to review what we did so far, all we were dealing with is the word elu treifot, is that dafka, or elu kshero dafka? And then from that, we got into Rabbanit, and therefore we went into Rabbanit. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. And the first case was the kaneh, the windpipe, and then we talked about if it has this hole in it, Rav Nachman says until the size of an issar italki. So Amar Ze'eri, another Israel Babylonia thing, but this is different than before. Ze'eri came from Israel, gets to Babylonia, and he says to the Babylonians, Atan delo mitchami lechon shiur. You don't know, you've never seen the shiur of an issar italki. You don't have that kind of coin. Shiure b'dinar kordina'ah. Okay, the shiur that you're looking for is a dinar kordina'ah. That's your parallel coin that's the same size as an issar italki. It is very important for them to know, right? For us to know, we don't know any of these coins, right, at this point, but he was helping them. And he tells them, Havi kipshita zutarti. It's also like the coins, the small coins. You find those, it's like the pennies, and you find those in the pumbedita. That's the ones they use. That's also the same size. Okay, so it's just identifying for them the size. Now we have a story, another interesting story. Amar Rabbi Chana Ptora'ah. Okay, Rabbi Chana, who was a shulchani is a money changer. He was a money changer. Ila mina havakai bar nafcha. Okay, in front of him comes bar nafcha. Bar nafcha is another name for Rabbi Yochanan. He was the son of the glassblower. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan comes before him. Uba mine dinar kordina'ah l'shiur be'trefta. He wanted a dinar kordina'ah. Where do you go? You go to the shulchani. In other words, he was going there to trade money. He was going there because he needed the size, that coin, so he could check the treifa and see the size. Okay, now the story isn't so interesting in terms of, okay, he wanted a dinar kordina'ah, beseder. Okay. But what happens in this story is a total side thing, which is, the guy, Rabbi Chana, who's sitting in the shulchani spot and money changer there, wants to get up to show respect for Rabbi Yochanan. V'lo shavke. Rabbi Yochanan wouldn't let him. Amar li shev b'ni shev. He said, sit, son, sit. Ein ba'alei umaniyot nitishisim halacha. When you're working, you're not allowed to la'amod mipnei talmidei chachamim b'sha'ah she'oskim b'mlachtan. If you're a baal umanut, you're a trade worker, and you're in the middle of work, you're not allowed to stand up for a rabbi. Okay, why is that? Well, this is a good question. Because there's a big nafkamina. Is it because someone else is paying you, and it's not your right to decide, how to spend their money, like they're paying you per hour, and, you're now spending time of your hour standing up, even though it's not very much time, but it's basically time that's not your own. Now, that would only be true, and this is why it's important to understand what the issue is, that would only be true if you work for someone else. What if you work for yourself? You could decide, right? Okay, I'll waste my money, I'll waste my time. So some people say it's only if you're working for someone else. Some people think it's no matter what, okay? You have a right, while you're working, you don't have to do this, okay? Specifically the Hebrew side of our website, so Sugya B'Tana this week from Rav Nachman is specifically on this topic of standing up for Talmidei Chachamim, and she adds there Talmidei Chachamot. And anyway, it's an interesting topic about, how important it is to stand and what if it comes in conflict with your job. Okay, so now he says, you don't have to stand up. To which they ask below, is that really true? V'hatznan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? Okay, let me give you the background. We're talking about bikurim. Bikurim are the first fruits that you bring on Shavuot, and also you can bring them up until Sukkot. Okay, there was a time period in which you would bring them. It wasn't all just one day. And people would bring them from wherever they lived. They would travel to Jerusalem, and bring their first fruits, right, wherever they lived in Israel. So now it says in the Mishnah, Kol ba'alei umaniyot umdim mipnehem v'shoalim b'shlomam v'omrim lahem. Okay, there's this procession of people. The Mishnah Bikurim is one of those descriptive Mishnayot describing what would happen when they would do that. The people would be coming with the Bikurim, and everybody, while they were working, these same Baalei Umaniyot, what would they do? They would omdim mipneihem, they would stand up, not just stand up. Shoalim b'shlomam, they would ask, how are you? V'omrim lahem, achenu anshe makom ploni, our brothers from the city in the Galilee or something. Boachem b'shalom, welcome to Jerusalem. Okay, so people would do that. Now, what do you see? They would stop their work. So if you can't stop your work for Talmidei Chachamim, how can you stop your work for people bringing bikurim? They're deserving of more respect. Doesn't make any sense. If it seemed like you could do it for them, you could do it for the rabbis. So Amal Rabbi Yochanan answers, Mipneihem omdim, mipnei Talmidei Chachamim ein omdim. Okay, it's not the most satisfying answer, but he says there's a difference. Those two are different categories. He doesn't explain why, but we're going to have two explanations in the Gemara, one attempt to explain and then a rejection of it, which basically explains it in a different way. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, bo re'eh kama chaviva mitzvah b'sha'ata. What you see here is how special is a mitzvah when it's being performed. When a mitzvah is being performed in its time, wow, that's amazing. Because look, they stand for them and they don't stand for Talmidei Chachamim. So it shows you how important it is, how beautiful and beloved is a mitzvah when its own time. Everybody gets up and shows respect for it. To which the Gemara says, Mimai, why are you assuming that's the case? Says, maybe there's a completely different reason here. It's not easy, okay, especially in those days when travel was complicated, right? They didn't have buses and trains and things like that and cars. It was hard for people to, and you have to carry your first fruits. That's really very schleppy. Maybe it's just so that the people do it again. You have to greet them because this is an important value. Otherwise, next time they're going to say, I'm not going to bother bringing bikurim. You want them to have a positive experience. We're going to have a positive experience where people greet you and people talk to you and people address you, right? And oh, from this place, wow, how amazing it is what you're doing. That makes you feel good and it encourages you. For that reason, I'm going to allow. For the Talmidei Chachamim, there's no reason. You don't need to stand up for them if you're in the middle of work. I mean, you should stand out of respect because they're even the representatives of God in this world to a certain extent. That comes up in Sugiyot, that they kind of represent the Torah and the Torah represents God. And that's right. And yes, it's very important, but not if you're on your job and, you're going to lose your focus, right? You could say it's just a second, but, we all know that as soon as you lose your focus from something, it's harder to get back. And, anyway, it's an interesting sugya about, the interplay here and how we, take certain situations and try to compare them and try to see if we can learn something from them. It's not always clear what we can learn. Okay. Amar Rav Nachman, last sugya for today. Kisela ki yater misela. Ki isal ki yater mi ki isal. Okay, the sela, we don't know what it's doing here. We'll talk about it in a minute. Let's start with the isal. He says, when it says in our Mishnah, what's kosher, right? Ad kama techsar, once there's a hole this big, it's going to be a problem in the windpipe. How big? Ki issar itaki. So now, when it's ad an issar, it says ad ki issar. Until an issar, it's okay. So ad, this is always the classic question. Up to and including an issar. So what if it's exactly an issar? Problem or not? So he says ki issar is like more than an issar, meaning as soon as it gets to the size of the issar, exactly the coin, it's already a problem. Because when it says until an issar, what it means is until, up to, but not including the issar. Up to an issar, it's okay. Past that, it's a problem. And he says it about a sela. When it talks about a sela, it's also going to be up to, but not including. Already the sela is a problem. Or a sela is like more than a sela. It could be a problem. It could be less, not a problem, depending on the sugya. So now there's a bit of a debate. I don't know if it's such an interesting debate, but there's a debate about what case of a sela he's talking about. So Rashi brings one about the plugta of the shteran, the gugolet. Remember, if it's missing, then already it's not mitame ba'oel. Okay. Rabbeinu Tam says it's talking about if the gluda, that if the skin is off, but there's still a sela there, then that's okay. Then it's not a treifa. But Tosfot rejects both those commentaries. Tosfot quotes Rabbeinu Tam and then says he rejects both Rashi and Tosfot for the simple reason that both those places it mentions a sela, it doesn't say until a sela, and therefore Tosfot says it's talking about some other treifa case. Okay, but the point is, he says, how could you say, because this is all about ad, until. What does until mean? Because that's what we're going to say right now, right? Alma kasavar Rav Nachman ad velo ad bichlal. Rav Nachman must hold on that side of the debate that up to means up to and including, and not including, and therefore he explains it that way. And that's why Tosafot says it can't be that, because none of them have the word ad in them. And this is obviously ad, up, right, up to, that's the issue here. Okay, we're going to start with some questions of Rav against Rav Nachman. We're only going to see the first two today. Rav Nachman, you have to know, as we're talking about Tuma and Tara here, and when something is susceptible to impurity, once it's ready, right, ready for use, or the beds in those days were these frames, okay, metal or wood, that they would then tie ropes. Okay, we had all these sugyas about this at some point, like in Masechet Shabbat. They would tie ropes across. So if you have a rope that's tied on the bed, the rope is part of the bed, and therefore it's susceptible to impurity. But what if your rope is there but hanging? It's like tied to one side of the bed, but it's just hanging and it's not yet there. Since if it's already a size that could be tied on the bed, it's already susceptible to impurity. If it's too short to be tied, it's just a rope hanging off a bed, then it's not. So Rava says, look at this, I assume it's a Mishnah. Just gonna look for a second. Yeah, it's a Mishnah in Kalim. The Mishnah says, if you have this rope coming out of the bed, up until 5 tvachim, it's fine, meaning it's not susceptible to impurity, it's tahor. My lav chamisha kelamata. Now, for whatever reason, he thinks that up to and including 5 is not a problem. And therefore he says, look, ad here means ad up to and including. To which Rav Nachman obviously answers, lo, chamisha kelamala. No, 5 up to 5. But from 5, it's already susceptible to impurity. Tashmas, then he says, look at the continuation. Rava says, mechamisha va'ad asara tameh. My lav, so 5 obviously is starting at 5. But then it goes until 10, and he thinks, my lav asara kilamata. He thinks from 5 up to and including 10. And therefore, again, question on Rav Nachman, to which Rav Nachman obviously answers, lo asara kilamala. No. 5 to 10 is already, right, is going to be susceptible to impurity. When you get to 10, now what does it mean here? This means that when you get to 10, whatever's beyond 10 is not needed, because the beds were 10 tefachim wide, and therefore anything beyond 10, so it's interesting, you could have this part of the rope that's beyond 10 is actually not susceptible to impurity. It seems hard to imagine, isn't it the same rope? But anything beyond 10, but what he says is it 10 and beyond, okay? Because 10, right, up to 10 does not include 10. 10 is already going to be the part that's susceptible, that's not susceptible to impurity. And with that, we finished the questions for today. We have more going forward. So what did we have today? We started with this, how much of a drusa in a kanen, a windpipe, and we said a mashu, even though usually the thing is big, needs to be bigger in the windpipe, but since it's going to spread, it's a problem. Then we said we had these two sugyas that talked about drusa needing bedika just by the torso. Rav came and said no, more than that, including the windpipe and the kanen, the veshet. Then we had, with that, we had the whole story, who's Rav and Reish Lakish and the whole back and forth there. Then we went to Zaklal. At the end of that Mishnah comes to include the Shev Shmatata, even though we saw that according to Rabbi Yochanan later on, we saw it doesn't include one of the Shev Shmatata. So then we had the Mishnah with all the Kshirot. Then we have the Mchlok of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Is it Elu Treifot Dafka or Elu Kshirot Dafka? And are we limiting? I'm sorry, it's right. So the one of the Shev Shmatata, right, would be included, this one of Rabbanit according to Reish Lakish, but wouldn't be included according to Rabbi Yochanan. From there, we got a little bit into that psul that Rabbanit talked about, and then we got back to what is an issar, what is it in the Babylonian currency. From there, we had a story talking about, where he went to the Shulchani, and the Shulchani wanted to stand up, and Rabbi Yochanan said, please don't, you're working. By the way, I forgot to mention that if the discussion that ensued with the question, because it's interesting, they raise a question, Rabbi Yochanan answers it. It's not sure if the Shulchani raised the question against him, which meant that in the end, the Shulchani engaged in a whole halachic conversation with him, which also distracted him from his work. So it might not have helped in the end anyway. But anyway, there was that, and why don't we stand for Talmidei Chachamim, and why do we stand for these Miviyei Bikurim? And then we ended with this Kisela right? Up to and including, or up to and not including. And in the end, Rav Nachman says it's not including, even though Rava tried to throw all these difficulties at him, where he claimed that the Mishnah meant up to and including, but Rav Nachman said, no, not necessarily. You could read it my way. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.